Hey folks, welcome to today's video. This is a 20 Junkyard done with the Warlock PoV. Running double Demonology Warlock, and we're running Grim Inquisitor's Legendary. Now, interestingly enough for this dungeon, we're going to kind of compare the two Warlocks and kind of how our performance was. Unfortunately though, due to a mistake on my end, not really paying attention to where my feet were, you can see that I'm kind of tunnel visioning, trying to get everything off, and immediately get one shot by standing in something that I shouldn't have done. This unfortunately has the rather detrimental impact in me not getting a tyrant out, missing quite a lot of ramp, and is very much the embodiment of bad DPS, essentially. Because you can see that the other Warlock managed to get their tyrant out, and mine was rushed, and there's no way this late into the pack I am going to be able to get my tyrant to do anything really practical. What I should have done in this case, had I been a little bit more aware, is hold my tyrant. Now, this group didn't really have any communication, so again, didn't really know much about pathing. And when it comes to picking up zap bots, I believe I was one of the later ones to pick up a zap bot. But that isn't really going to affect the overall damage of this dungeon too much, because Demonology Warlocks don't get as much benefit out of zap bot as some of the other classes. Now, the run that you're seeing on screen is a weak aura that comes about when the malfunctioning scrap bots are doing their whirlwind, or their spinning attack. Now, interestingly enough, while I was doing one of these dungeons, I was told about the fact that they actually continue the animation even though they only do one instance tick of damage. So you can actually move out and then move back in. And I heard that from a hunter. I don't know exactly how true that is, because obviously I haven't done many runs of Junkyard as a melee DPS, and as a Warlock I'm usually out of the problem anyway, so don't really have to worry too much there. But something that you could bear in mind for melee DPS. Now, this is obviously the first 20 I've done in Season 4. It is a Junkyard, so it's not as impressive as, say, a lower Karazhan would be, but still, it's interesting to see how generous the key is. Now, this particular route is a little bit different to what I'm used to. I would have thought that we would have taken and cleared around the boss area first, but evidently not in this case. So, we are fighting this lurker on its own, which is slightly problematic, and we should have really had maybe 2 or 3 mobs pulled onto each other for this, because fighting one-on-one isn't really that beneficial. And ideally is something that you want to massively minimize. Now you can see that for these monstrosities I'm placing a circle down, and this is so that I can teleport out, as you saw there, during the consumes. Because hopefully, by the time that the second consume comes out, the monstrosity will be dead. Or at least that's the plan anyway, but you can see that I can use Soul Shape to get out of it. Now, one interesting thing both between me and the other Warlock is, aside from that first initial pack, in terms of overall damage, me and the other Warlock seem to be slightly different in how our damage profiles work. This other Warlock, Oyam, I think that's how you pronounce the name, seems to have a much burstier playstyle. Now, I'm not 100% sure if I inspected the gear during the key or prior to the key, but if memory serves, they have Mechagon rings. And they have increased haste during certain windows, which means that during their Tyrant windows, they're getting that increased value, for want of a better term, in the haste, whereas I still don't have the Mechagon rings. They've proved rather elusive. And on top of that, I am running the quote-unquote base raid trinket in the form of the Shadowed Orb of Torment and Kabbalist's Hymnal, rather than using the 2-minute versatility trinket from Iron Docks, the versatility one that's doing the rounds at the moment and is quite popular, because that is essentially working out to be a almost better version of the first sigil, which kind of had the problem in that although it granted a lot of versatility, it was on a 5-minute cooldown. By lowering the versatility amount slightly and having a 2-minute cooldown, it lines up perfectly with things like Grimoire. And as an orc, Blood Fury as well, which is quite nice. And if you're running Wilfred's in a raid setting, it lines up with every other Tyrant, which is quite nice. Whereas Shadow Orb requires you to channel it beforehand. And as a byproduct of that, although I don't have the haste / versatility for these burst windows, I have a more gentle, almost ramp-esque type of damage profile. So you'll be seeing a lot of, through these fights, you can kind of see roughly when me and the other Warlock both pop our Tyrants. Like, they're only slightly desynced by about 5 seconds. But you can kind of see that this other Warlock will burst much harder than I will, but towards the end of the Tyrant and after the Tyrant, I will then start catching up or pulling ahead due to kind of how our profiles are working. Now, this is a point of difference between the two of us. You can see that I've popped my Tyrant to maintain it on cooldown, whereas the other Warlock has actually held theirs. So we're about to go into the next pull, and the Warlock is going to have their Tyrant. But the flip side of this is I'm going to have Tyrant back for the boss, whereas they might not. You can see just an army of imps. Again, having a lurker on its own, not ideal really. We want to pull this onto the 2 other elementals, because you really don't want to be fighting things on their own. Yes, it is currently a Sanguine week when we're doing this, but you can still pull these elementals out of the Sanguine. Kind of fighting things one-on-one is just... It slows things down unnecessarily. Now you can see that the other Warlock had in fact popped their Tyrant, but wasn't really doing a whole hell of a lot. Now, we end up in this really awkward situation now, because we're about to get Tyrant back, and we still have a monstrosity to kill. So there has to be the thought of, do I pop Tyrant, and if so, when? And as the case was, I immediately popped it on cooldown, thinking that between everything else, I'm going to have just over a minute, probably, until we're at the boss, and I can put Tyrant into the boss 20 or 30 seconds in, and it won't be that problematic. Or at least that's my thinking. Because obviously these monstrosities on a fortified week do have 1.8 million health, so hopefully this thing is going to take a while to die. You can see that we both put our circles down, we both teleport out. I could have probably teleported out a little bit faster to increase casting time, but eh. So we're probably going to get a second consume at this point, because we're due one, and as you can see, it's about to come out, and we've got Soul Shape to get out of the situation if it occurs. Which we do. Now, because of the desync, Warlock has their Tyrant to start, and I have 15 seconds to ramp into my Tyrant. Now, because I had 15 seconds, I probably shouldn't have propped my macro, but I definitely should have fully channeled my Shadow Orb of Torment, because that maximizes my mastery. You can see now that we're in a position where I need to try and ramp everything, and I managed to get an 8 imp Tyrant out and still managed to extend my Dreadstalkers, which was quite fortunate, because this fight is slightly problematic from a movement perspective. Realistically, some of this movement, though, is unnecessary, because what I could do is I could kind of stay in one position and hope that when it comes to things like Toxic Wave, there is something near me. That would in turn have increased my overall DPS, but for the sake of safety, I prefer to be in one of these squirt bots for the majority of the fight, unless we're in a situation like you can see here, where by standing still, one is actively walking towards me, which allows me to maintain a little bit more uptime and benefit from actually tunneling slightly. Get some more health stones. There we go. Inspect. Oh no, he didn't have the Mechagon rings. But still, due to stat differences and things like that, he had a burstier profile. Only problem with having two Demonology Warlocks stood on top of each other, unless you directly look at your UI for things like how many imps you've got out for your Tyrant and things like that, you can't really see where your imps end and theirs start. You just end up with just a patch of imps, which can be quite distracting at times. So, from a personal UI perspective, I probably need to look at trying to make it a little bit more clear how many imps I have out at any given time. Especially if I am going to be playing with other Demonology Warlocks and we're all stacked in a certain location. Because the last thing you want is to see on screen you being surrounded by imps, but then going for a Tyrant and realizing that, you know, those imps aren't actually yours. Which could drastically impact your overall damage as a Demonology Warlock. Which, as we currently look at the overall, the other Warlock is on 17.4 and I'm on 15.6. And a lot of this is down to my rather poor showing at the start of the dungeon, where I got potted. Yay. Or because I tried to think, I'm a Warlock, I can survive this. This isn't going to hurt, right? I can get this cast off. Yeah, no, don't do things like that. Now, I know this isn't necessarily relevant to the current dungeon, but we will be discussing in a later video the changes and updates to Warlocks for Dragonflight, because the way the Tyrant works with demonic consumption has been removed and instead been replaced by something similar in the form of tyranny. So it's still got benefits from how many pets you have out, but they no longer have stamina scaling as Decon does. So certain talents and things like that that affect your health and the health of your pets aren't necessarily as powerful as they were previously, with Decon being relevant. But we'll discuss that in a later video. Now, one thing that is noticeable throughout the course of this dungeon as well is the difference in use of defensives between me and the other Warlock. Outside of that incident at the start, haven't really needed to use my cooldowns in any way, shape or form because I've been able to stay out of a lot of danger. Like that, Life Cocoon and Panic Healing from our tank was from our monk, sorry, was probably unnecessary. Although I did Dark Pact to essentially further mitigate any damage I needed or I would take at that point. Whereas you can see that our other Warlock has cycled through all their defensives, with both Unending Resolve and Dark Pact both being on CD. Which could be a positional thing, like they're actively closer to the fight, or they could be standing in things and just getting slapped around. / focused by these grunters because they do fixate. Not great, but can't be helped at times. Now, personal observation, just going back 10 seconds, is we'll go back 20 seconds actually. As we go into this, you see I have 4 stacks, or I quickly generate a couple of Hand of Gul'dans. I have 4 demonic core charges and I implode first. What I should have done is I should have used those demonic core procs and then imploded afterwards. The reason for this is because you obviously cap out at 4 demonic core procs. So 4 free demon bolt casts. And when you implode something, or when your imps die, you have a chance of getting another one. So there's every possibility there that in that implosion I wasted 1 or 2 free molten core procs, which isn't great. So, personal thing on my end. And another thing as well is, although it's something that I need to work on, my use of dogs, I'm still waiting like a global or 2 before casting it. So something I need to be more aware of. So you can see there that I was going to cast a 2 shard Hand of Gul'dan, something I still need to work on. But thankfully the pack died before I could follow through. But what I should have done is I should have used dogs instead. So need to wake up a little bit on the rotation still. But we're getting there, slowly. Now, again, a little bit of desync on the Tyrants. I've got a minute left, and our other Warlock's got 40 seconds. And our Monk just got slapped. Not entirely sure how that happened, but they should be okay. Or they would have been okay, probably, to stay dead, or should have got a combat res from me, Warlock, or the Druid. Generally, in these situations, you end up relying on kind of the Druid to do it, because their cast can be instant, and also if they're running I believe it's a finesse conduit, where combat resin gives your target food, and it's actually better than feast, because it's like 20 of your primary stat. So, pretty nice. Now, we end up in a situation where slight desync, so I need to try and generate imps. Unfortunately, I don't generate many imps at all. They all time out. And the only reason for my spike in damage there was because of an appropriate implosion. And both me and the other Warlock had the same idea. We imploded for a little bit of pad damage, and we're now in a territory of who has the most mastery or the greatest amount of pets out at a given moment. And you can see that we're kind of even outside of our Tyrants, for the most part. But my Tyrant was considerably weaker, because it was a 1 imp Tyrant. And this is partially due to having that desync. because I tried then rushing to get my Tyrant out immediately, and what I should have done is just, you know, take a moment, reset, and cast my Tyrant, say, 10 seconds later. Again, that was a poor thing on my end. It was a Hand of Gul'dan, but Dogs was off CD, should have cast Dogs. And I just eked out a win there over the other Warlock. Now, these scrap bots, generally speaking, nothing to really write home about. Unfortunately, though, the exhaust mechanic where they put basically a smoke bomb on the ground is really problematic. It can have its benefits on the rare occasion that, you know, you've just summoned a boatload of imps and they're about to die, like a situation like that. So then, because the way that imps work is they obviously have a finite amount of energy. This is aimed at the newer warlocks. So I do apologize if it sounds like I'm teaching anyone to suck eggs here. But imps have a cast bar, essentially, of X amount of energy. And each Fellbolt cast depletes that energy. Implosion also works off that energy amount because it does damage based on how much energy the imps have to your primary target, and secondary targets take damage as though it was full energy. Now, if you summon a bunch of imps and they can't complete a cast because the target's in a smoke bomb or something like that, they will persist and they will hold that energy. It doesn't deplete over time. Imps still do have a finite length of time they can hang around before they are just, you know, removed anyway. But sometimes that exhaust mechanic can help you further build on imps leading into something like a Tyrant window. It's not something to necessarily always be worrying about, but it can be beneficial at times. More of the time it's actually just annoying, but something to, you know, silver linings and all that. Now, both me and the other Warlock both popped our Tyrants for Zugamox. Was probably a good shout, to be honest, but one could say it might have been overkill. Because and as you can see by my UI, I can't see if the Survival Hunter has any cooldowns and when he's popping them. Now, we have a Crawler. Again, these Crawlers kind of hurt, so this is probably one of the few mobs within Junkyard, at least, where you might want to actually pull it on its own. For a 20, probably not so much, especially when you're as geared as we are. We could probably get away with pulling it into, say, the 3-pack that's over here just above my action bar, or we could at least be moving it into another location. Because just fighting it static, again, is needlessly slow. There are some situations where you might actually end up pulling a Crawler on top of another pack anyway, through ease of use and just generally having things easier. Now, finally, I get my Grease Bot, which is additional haste, because one thing from Warlocks, especially Decon Warlocks at the moment, is we benefit from the stamina, the haste, and zap. And so getting the armor plating and having increased health is beneficial because that just feeds into your Tyrant. It also makes us that wee bit tankier. Now, we got Scrapper, we got the Crawler's pulled. We now have a situation where we're fighting 2 targets. The mechanic is going to get cleaved, stunned, and generally controlled. So the only thing to worry about is the Crawler and the Scrap Cannon and making sure that the mechanic doesn't tune up or repair the Crawler. Now, Not 100% sure why the other Warlock took damage there. I think it may have been stood in a scrap cannon, which explains why I was the one with the most amount of health and required the least healing, but still. Warlock's doing well, rotating its CDs quite nicely. Dark Pact probably could have been used a little bit more frequently, and I don't know if they're making use of Mortal Coil, because remember, Dark Pact and Mortal Coil together is essentially health neutral and gives you a huge shield as a result. So, something to utilize. Now, in this situation, we're about to pull a boss, and it's trying to keep as many pets or imps active as possible so we can go into this. So you can see that we summon dogs, we hand a Gul'dan a second time, immediately into Soul Rod and into Tyrant. Now, that was probably the worst thing I could have done, had it not have been for the fact that I'd literally got my Tyrant out. Because this situation, in and of itself, actually proves just where our damage is for Demonology. So if we go back again 20 seconds, at this point, Mega Crash is about to pod me. I've got all my buffs rolling. I've podded, I've got the mastery buff from Shadow Orb, which is a huge amount of mastery. I've got all my pets out, my Tyrant's doing his thing, and I'm podded. But I'm still doing 20k DPS because my Tyrant's out. And then I'm out. Tyrant's disappeared, which means that I then have 14 seconds of all my pets doing increased damage. I can throw things out, I can implode because we're now on 2 targets, and we can kind of focus some damage into Mega Crash, while Taser is getting essentially kind of cleaved down. Really simple, really easy fight. But you can see that I do Demonology so much damage. As soon as your Tyrant's out, you are pretty much useless. Unfortunately, still not the best. Like, it's no excuse. I should have moved and been more aware of my surroundings. But I was fortunate in that case, and very, very lucky, that I'd managed to get my Tyrant out in time. I don't particularly like running through that area like that, because there's every possibility that you can get caught out by the stealth dogs. Like here. So I now have 2 bleeds on me from the Panthers, and I have to use all of my cooldowns plus a health potion in order to stay alive. And Rebemma does a fantastic job of keeping me alive, but that ate both Dark Pact, Mortal Coil, and Unending Resolve, because 2 Prowlers landed on me. That temptation is also because I'm running one of the Karazhan rings from Upper Kara. So, not great, to be honest. And this is why I don't like deviating too much where these stealthers can be, unless you have something like a Demon Hunter that can pull them out, and we can kind of lock them down and prevent people from getting that bleed on them, because it's really horrible. And as a result, for that DPS at least, my priority for that was to survive, because I obviously want to maintain Zap for this last boss. I want to maintain my buffs. Now, that was a really good implosion as well from the other Warlock. You can see that we'd banked things, they'd been a little bit faster, and as a result they managed to peak at about 65k overall with that implosion, which is rather nice. But over the course of the pack, didn't really help them that much, because I'm still able to maintain with them. So, all in all, not too shabby. Now, a bit of unnecessary damage being taken there. Other Warlock decided to just stand in the artillery fire. So, little bit of work on Rebember's part, but all in all, not too bad. Now, this particular boss fight is a little bit odd because you can use Tyrant on MK1, like the other Warlock has done here, and I suppose in some cases, especially on Tyrannical weeks, this might, especially for higher Tyrannical, this might actually be the better shout if you're running one Demonology Warlock. But as you can see, my decision is actually to hold for the second or third stage when HK8 actually comes down. Now, hopefully, I land this right. And I don't. Yeah, because I got caught by the beam underneath. Because you can see there that it worked for the other person. So that is a viable skip. The problem is you can't allow for the blue floor underneath to essentially activate prior to you going up, because obviously Gateway isn't classed as a blink, which means that you are affected by underground effects. Soul Shape into Gateway, which puts me right at the boss, and this Demon Bolt probably wasn't the best shout, but this was because I wanted to try and get some damage out. You can also see that as a result, we also only 6 Imp Tyrant, which isn't fantastic, but the speed at which HK8 is going down, you can kind of see where things are. So you've got to be a lot faster to react when you're playing that way than if you're to, you know, use Tyrant for the Mark 1. Now, if I was to play this dungeon again, taking aside the first initial pack and being potted during the Tyrant ramp window, I would probably use Tyrant on the HK8 going forward, because there's still plenty of time to deal with HK8 as it's down in the damage increase phase just by playing normally, I think. And although at the end of the HK8 I pulled more DPS, it kind of felt like more pad DPS than anything else. But overall, I was second bested, and there was only about 700 DPS in it over the course of the dungeon, which is brought down to that first pack, primarily, and a couple of decent things here with Tyrants. But all in all, felt like it was a good key. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed it, and if you've liked this video, you'll hit me up with a subscribe, and we'll try and break the 700 sub mark, as that is literally just around the corner. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I will catch you all in the next one. Take care.